So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Snorik, and I'm the chair of the Wyndham World Affairs Council. I'll be moderating the event today. And my colleague who's behind the scenes is a new board member. Her name is Maya Segura, and she's going to be handling the technical side of this talk. There she is. And we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Tamara Stenn today to share with us a talk that's titled Indigenous Sustainability, Regeneration, and Hope, Harvesting Bolivia's Royal Quinoa. And this presentation is addressing work that Dr. Stenn carried out in the context of Fulbright, but she currently is a Landmark College professor. She's resided in Brattleboro for over 20 years, and she travels frequently to Bolivia, which she considers to be her second home. So she's going to take us on a tour, a journey to Bolivia during this talk, and present to us the story of Royal Quinoa, which is about a 100-year-old hand-planted variety that is considered to be sacred by the indigenous producers in Bolivia. In turn, we're going to be bringing in Celia Arcane, and she's one of the producers now working with Dr. Stenn on a cooperative in Bolivia. So she'll be joining us via WhatsApp through Tamara's video. So we have some technological achievements to accomplish with with a cell phone and a computer, but it's all going to come together. So just briefly about Dr. Stenn. Dr. Tamara Stenn, she's an economist and a social enterprise developer, author, researcher, as well as a professional studies faculty and coordinator at Landmark College in the Entrepreneurship Accelerator Program, or the LEAP program at Landmark College. So Landmark College is a school that specializes in teaching students with learning differences. And as beyond her professorship in 2018, Dr. Stenn completed a Fulbright study on the well-being of Bolivian women who are quinoa growers, with whom she founded a cooperative. And those cooperative farmers, along with Dr. Stenn, called this a perfect seed. And she'll be sharing a lot more information about a perfect seed, as well as where you might be able to find some of these perfect seeds. She's also published several books and journal articles about her work and about the experiences through her Fulbright in Bolivia. I also wanted to tell you a little bit about our upcoming talks. So in December, we're going to host Marble College alumnus Art Magida in a talk about a book he wrote called Codename Madeline, a Sufi spy in Nazi-occupied Paris. And this is a biography about Noor Inayat Khan, and it was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. So Magida will discuss his work on Noor, who is a poet, musician, and Sufi princess, and who served as his secret agent for the British in France during World War II. And Magida's talk will be held on Sunday, December 13th. Like all of our events, today's event is free and open to the public here on Zoom. We're the smallest member of the National Organization of the World Affairs Councils of America, and we are entirely run by volunteers. Our annual memberships support our operating costs, and if you're interested in becoming a member, you can find further information on our website where you registered for this Zoom event. A few housekeeping notes, and then I'm going to pass the microphone over to Dr. Stenn. This talk is going to be followed by a question and answer session. And also we are recording, and we are also streaming this live on Facebook Live. Once the talk is finished, we will use the video and post it onto YouTube, so it'll be shared, so it can be shared more widely for people who weren't able to attend the event. In order to ask a question for this talk, we ask that you use the question and answer function, or the Q&A function that you see on your Zoom screen. We'd appreciate if you don't use the chat function for questions, though we wouldn't mind if there's a need to or desire to chat with others or share links about things that are happening during the talk in the chat, that's fine. But for question and answers, just to make it easier on us for moderation, we ask that you enter your questions and answers in the Q&A. When you enter your question in the Q&A, also please feel free to add your name and your location so we can know who we're talking with. So without further ado, I'll pass this over to Dr. Stenn. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Julie. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. So here we are. We're going to take a journey to Bolivia, right? Learn a little bit about what's going on with quinoa, okay, which has become a superfood, kind of a world-known item, something really in demand now, especially in times of COVID, as people are looking for really nutritious food and different alternatives to boring home cooking recipes, right? So let's find out, what is this all about? What's going on in Bolivia? What's the story of the Royal Quinoa? So Julie did a great job kind of giving a little bit of my background. I got to Bolivia in 1996 as a Peace Corps volunteer, where I was working as a small business developer, and I started a newspaper, and that's how I got to know the rural people and the ways of the countryside. I became a family member. My kid's dad is Bolivian, so I was able, and they're from the highlands, so I was able to really firsthand get to know a lot about the Quechua people and the highland communities. Came to Brattleboro in 1999 to do my master's at SIT and stayed, started a business, also working with the Highlanders in Bolivia, working with alpaca sweaters. Did some work kind of examining that relationship, writing a book that's based on my doctoral thesis, Is Fair Trade Fair? Right? And that's what the women used to ask me as we're working on orders, and I was dictating prices to them and telling them what the markets were doing. They're like, well, how do we know? Right? How fair is fair trade? And that was a really great question. As an economist, I started looking at that more. I wrote another book about sustainable development based on sumac camana, which is one of the ways of being that's part of the Andean cosmovision that we're going to talk a little bit about here, because we're working with indigenous producers with an indigenous mindset, and it's different than the Western ways of thinking. But we are competing in Western markets with a global product. So we have these different points of entry, right, that sometimes are kind of at a tug of war with each other. So we're going to be looking at that today. My Fulbright was all about the well-being of indigenous women quinoa growers, and that was kind of based on my questions after working with the handicraft women and coffee growers that I wrote about in my cultural political book. Like Julie says, I'm from Landmark College now, and A Perfect Seed is a project that's actually, it's a hybrid cooperative where we're working with Landmark College students in the form of a live case study. So a lot of the work that's been done on this project since my Fulbright has ended in 2018 has been driven by the Landmark College students as they explore marketing and business development in my classes. So let's go take a look at what's going on. We started off with the Fulbright, okay? So from 2015 to 18, I was sent down to Bolivia to work with quinoa producers. And Fulbright specifically likes to send you someplace where you don't really know what's going on. I knew the highland people very well. I did not know quinoa producers very well. I knew the Quechua people very well. I did not know the Aymara. So here I was putting to a situation that was kind of new on all ends, and I needed to be able to understand it, study it, measure it, and have proper instruments to be able to then share my findings with the rest of the world. So this is going to be a little bit of an introduction to that process and what I found. So in case you didn't know, I didn't know, Bolivia is located in the middle of South America. It's a very isolated highland country. It's the most indigenous of the Americas, meaning that more than 60% of the population identify as indigenous. The main spoken languages are still Quechua and Aymara, Guarani, and of course Spanish is the national language. The quinoa is grown in the salt flats, okay, which are huge. They can be seen from the moon. They're used for people to calibrate their satellites because it's flat. But anyway, that's where the quinoa grows, okay? So politically, okay, so Bolivia just had an elections, okay? So I just am creating a little bit of post-research context just so that we can understand the dynamics of our market, where we are now, what the future of quinoa is going to be. So in 2020, we had elections in Bolivia, and the MAS party was elected overwhelmingly. Luis Arce, right here, was elected as president. David Choquehuanca is the vice president. And here we have Palacio Condori, who's the vice minister of decolonization. So in Bolivia, in the indigenous uprising or indigenous reemergence was kind of brought forth in 2009 when Evo Morales became the first indigenous, actually the second, but the first internationally recognized indigenous president to be elected in Bolivia. And he ruled until there was a coup last year backed by the US that kicked him out. And that's when Janine Áñez came in. And she was supposed to kind of guide the country through the new elections, which I think they were expecting to win, at least with Carlos Mesa, and it didn't happen. Okay, so the new elections, the people came forward and said, no, 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 we still want our party. And the country's divided, right? Just like we see this in many places around the world. So the pink of the lowlands, very rich, wealthy lowlands here, lots of cattle and soybeans, wood, lumber, oil, gas. Okay, and here's the highlands. Okay, this is where the quinoa grows, and the highlands are traditionally more impoverished. It's mining. There's not a lot of robust agriculture there. And these are the tropics right here, the Yungas. Okay, so we're in this political situation. Here's Congress. Mas is gaining the majority of the seats in the Congress. So we're back to this time of indigenous rule. Okay, back in 2010, when David Choquehuanca was the Bolivian foreign minister, he's one of the pioneers in writing about Vivir Bien, which is one of my favorite areas of study. And it brings forth the Andean cosmovision, based on the Andean cross, also known as Sumac Camana, which guided the pre-Inca people in how they governed and understood their societies and each other. And what we're going to do is look at how this Sumac Camana, how this Vivir Bien is coming into and is a part of modern political economy in Bolivia and many Andean nations. But let's start with this quote from David Choquehuanca. We can't wait for governments and international movements to solve our problems. We must do it ourselves. And that's really key when we look at this Bolivian story, because we're going to see a dynamic here between doing it yourself and international market competition. And it's not easy. So here's Pachacuti. Right now we're in a time of Pachacuti, which was predicted thousands of years ago. It's a time of earth change. And Sumac Camana has been brought forth as an indigenous model that was reimagined, okay, into the modern times. And back in 2009, when we had this big resurgence of indigenous knowledge and recognition with the Bolivian president, the United Nations was also working with Bolivia and coming up with the 6 principles of Sumac Camana, which is looking at community first. Okay, so not the individual, looking at the collective, sufficient but not efficient economy. So the idea of looking more towards nature systems where we're working with redundancy and abundance, right? An apple tree produces many apples, not just one. So it's not efficient, right? It's producing way too many. If it's trying to reproduce itself, it only needs 1 apple, but it's producing more than that. So using that idea, like what's sufficient, having local production and local consumption, having the idea of less is more. So not trying to create as much value as you possibly can, but just creating enough. And the idea that we're all part of Mother Earth and that we own our health, learning, and communication. So kind of bringing back people's sense of ownership and control of what they know about themselves and their environment. So when we're looking at this, it also brings forth this idea of empowerment. And something that's really important is the Bolivian people, before they had their indigenous president, they had been suppressed for 500 years. And that's something that's very strong in their collective ways of being. And this is a recently created mural by Clement Martin that really exemplifies this. So we're looking at this idea of hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, followed by the American money. And we have these impoverished mining communities and contaminated waters and all the indigenous peoples just as these gray lumps of something in the background. And the Earth Mother being angry, right, trying to hold all of this together. And then we still have the environment robust, right, and the pink flamingos flying through and the repressed people rising up with their hands unbound, in anger. But we have these people moving forward, very pensive, right, to this place of contamination. And what this really is showing is kind of like this intersectionality of where Bolivia is now. As they're competing in a global world. They've had very strong economy for the last, since 2009, right, where they've had about a 3 to 5% economic growth every single year. They've been managing the natural resources, not well, to an extent, not overproducing their products. But at the same time, in the quinoa story, we're going to see how global markets have just really knocked out the market from under the feet of the quinoa producers. And trying to uphold these ideas of respect and balance make it really difficult when you're fighting in a global market. In the past, quinoa was something that was banned by the Spanish when they came to Bolivia. They took away market access for the rural people. They prohibited land ownership until the 1952 rebellion. And historically, there's been very low education in the countryside, isolation, repression. Okay, so the people that we're working with, the quinoa growers, are coming from this environment. And I made a quick little video I'm going to show you guys that sort of introduces a little bit of our quinoa story. It's just a few minutes long, so pay attention. And here we go. All right, and what we're going to do is let's close out of that, and we're going to come back to our slideshow. Okay, and that gives us a little bit of the view of the Bolivian countryside, a little bit of a feel of what it feels like to be there. A lot of those pictures were taken by my daughter, who was 13 years old at the time and accompanied me on some of my research. She was my staff photographer. So big thanks to Muzi for taking some of those photos. So to get ourselves grounded a little bit in what we just saw there. So who produces the quinoa? We have 31,400 families, and that was from my observation, spending 3 years. My way of doing research is ethnographic studies, so I go out there and I spend time with these families. So my daughter and I would show up in these rural buses in the middle of nowhere with no cell service, and you couldn't even see us on the Google Maps. We didn't exist anymore. And you know, just find these amazing families and stay with them, you know, and live with them in their homes and work with them in their fields and really get that feel of what does it mean to be a quinoa producer. So these are families that we actually met and stayed with. This is in Yavica, Potosi, where we have the highland hand-grown quinoa. This is Doña Miguelina. I stayed in her house. She's a great cook. And this is, you know, 30% of the quinoa is hand planted and mountain grown. Okay, these are the salt flats behind Miguelina that you saw in the video. We have volcanoes in the background. So this is what makes the soil so rich. Okay, we have a lot of salt from the salt flats and the minerals from the volcanoes. I've put a magnet on the soil and it pops right up and sticks to the magnet. It's magnetic soil. It's full of minerals and vitamins. And that's what makes the quinoa so important, because the quinoa is a bioaccumulator. And only the quinoa that grows on the shores of the salt flats that has access to this extreme soil. We're at 14 and 15,000 feet above sea level at this point. And this quinoa gets huge amounts of ultraviolet rays from the sun. It absorbs all these intense minerals and salts from the soil, and that goes into the seeds. And we end up with a seed that has tremendous omega-3s, it has antioxidants, it has magnesium and calcium, you know, and all this richness and complete proteins, which no other plant is able to produce except for the quinoa. And that goes back to the story of it being a gift from the gods, right? Because it really is a plant that's distinct from anything else around it. 70% of the quinoa is hand harvested on the plains. Rumor has it that back here is where the original Atlantis comes from. You know, who knows if that's true, but these are the quinoa fields, okay? And the quinoa is sporadic, right? It's not like, you know, our wheat fields in the US or cornfields that go on forever. You can't plant quinoa like that. It has to be sporadic. It has to be in patches because the soil is delicate, it's arid, it can't sustain massive production of quinoa. You need to rotate it. So some of the fields here are fallow right now because they're in rotation. Okay, and you don't get tremendous yields. You can see there's big sections of the quinoa that's not necessarily growing well. Okay, so the yields are loose, and that's part of the sustainability of the planting, actually. Okay, if you look at how the Native Americans originally planted here in the United States, they also planted in that way of patchy production, because you have to make room for nature along with your production of food. So when is it produced? So quinoa is produced from September to May. Okay, they're south of the equator, so right now it's late summer. The challenges that we have is freezing, drought, insects, and market pricing. Okay, in 9 months, a lot of things can go south. All right, here I am attempting to weed the quinoa fields, okay? And in 9 months, you get a lot of work, okay? Some of the things that can happen is hail, drought, pests. So for example, with climate change, we have hail coming early. It can knock down these plants and destroy them. This plant is about 3 months old at this point. The seed heads are gonna grow to be 2 pounds. They're huge, they have tremendous economic value. Here, a little rabbit ate off my seed head. That seed head will never recover. They just lost 2 pounds of quinoa only 3 months into the production cycle. So it's a huge amount of liability. The women call these plants their babies. You know, they take 9 months to grow, just like a baby to be born. And they'll lovingly walk up and down their fields and kiss their quinoa plants and talk to them and know who each plant is as it's growing. And this is considered an extreme sadness to see a head that's been broken like that. And the rabbit that ate this is actually a non-native species that was brought in by the Spanish. Another thing with the quinoa is it's not just growing it, you have to fertilize it, plant it. It's fertilized with llama manure, which is super important because there's a very low humidity in the area. There's very low organic content in the soil, which means it doesn't break down easily, and the plants can easily be burnt, like a nitrogen fertilizer will not work in that place. You have to have the natural llama manure, and llamas are not so easy to come by anymore. So that's a huge problem. We're going to talk about that. It needs to be planted, weeded, fumigated. I put that in quotes because they use natural fumigation. It's organic. Harvested, threshed, shifted, window, packaged, and transported. So the quinoa grows in these seed heads. The seeds need to be taken out of the heads, and then the shells need to be removed from the seeds. And that's what we see happening here also when they were stepping on it with their feet, right? That's how we're getting the shells out of the seeds. After that, the farmers here, remember our 31,000 farmers, they all were earning a lot of money selling quinoa back in 2011, 12, and 13. And they took that money and spent it on building these huge industrial plants to be able to process their own quinoa for export markets with sophisticated machinery. And they continue to use these plants to export their quinoa. So after it's all been hand processed, as you've seen, then it goes to their own cooperative, okay, to their own production facility where they then pay their own staff to go and get this quinoa ready for export to Europe, to Australia, China, the United States, Canada. Okay, a 20-foot container is worth $53,000. So this is quinoa that's going to go to the United States. This is in Salinas, Oruro, the quinoa capital. In 2017, 1,391 containers left Bolivia for different parts of the world. That's an average of 115 containers a month at a value of $6.1 million. So this wasn't just pocket change. You know, this was a big, sophisticated market that the most impoverished, remote, undereducated producers of Bolivia were able to come together collectively, manage, and benefit from. And that's a huge story right there. Where it's being sold, this is part of the sadness of the story, is that despite all of that sophistication, work, and effort, still 70% of this amazingly produced quinoa, certified organic, a lot of it is fair trade, is being sold on the black market of Chayapata, which means it's being sold without any market controls or oversight and without any benefits or protections to the Bolivian people. So buyers come in often from Peru and from other countries and just buy it as cheap as they can. They'll bargain down the price as much as they can, and the farmers just have to either sell it or not sell it. And 30% of the quinoa is sold, you know, through the associations and cooperatives, as we saw, to legitimate, you know, export markets. But most of it is not sold. It's sold through the informal economy, which really is not benefiting our farmers. At the same time, there's huge world demand for quinoa, as you guys probably know. Here we have 2009 when Evo became president of Bolivia. So we saw this huge, insurgence of valuing, right, of these indigenous foods. 2013, the United Nations called quinoa the International Year of the Quinoa. They recognized quinoa as a superfood because of the proteins, the omega-3, the antioxidants. Global demand continued to grow. Millions of dollars of demand for this quinoa, starting in Europe, expanding to Canada, the United States, other countries, and this is just 2011. So that line continued to go up. And what happened also is the demand for the quinoa drove the price of quinoa, right? So here we are, 2010, 2014, right? The year of the quinoa, $5,335 for a ton of quinoa. Okay, so this was a boom. We saw this tremendous boom. People that for years had just been scraping by on less than $3 a day, subsistence farmers, isolated, hours away from the city, no electricity, no water, no education, no hospitals, no transportation, just remotely isolated out there. Two things happened. Evo became president, put a ton of money into the countryside, brought transportation, roads, electricity, hospitals, education to these people, and he's also from the quinoa region. And at the same time, the world started to discover quinoa, and it became a superfood. So we had these two things happening at once, and it drove up the prices incredible, and the farmers were able to sustain that production, meet that market demand until the rest of the world started producing quinoa. So we had a bust. So what happened was, and I'm going to take a pause in just a minute to do questions, okay, because I know we've covered a lot of ground so far. But what's happened was so far is we've had this production of quinoa. And as the rest of the world is seeing this demand, guess what? They're going to grow it. And guess what? We have this, this vision, this view of quinoa as a gift from the gods. And one of the conditions, legend says, that the gods gave the Bolivians when they gave them this quinoa was that they need to share it with humanity. This is a gift for humanity to be shared during times of extreme change. So the Bolivians feel this deep, deep commitment, right? This deep, deep promise of their ancestors to share the quinoa with the world to help save humanity. So they're conflicted because while they want to help save humanity, they also would like to be able to eat and live themselves. Okay, and what happened was by them sharing their quinoa, which is a very adaptable seed, other countries were able to change that quinoa. Okay, it's very adaptable. It's not GMO. They changed the quinoa, just hybridization, right? Of how they're able to grow it. And now they have it growing faster and quicker and shorter and longer. It can grow in all kinds of soils. It can be mass produced using all kinds of industrial mechanisms in Peru and France and China and Canada. They have massive amounts of quinoa that they're able to produce with massive more yields than Bolivia. They've taken non-traditional quinoa lands and turned them over into these massive quinoa fields with 2 harvests a year, and they've just outproduced Bolivia. What they also did was they dumbed down the quality of that quinoa, because nobody can create the quinoa that they do in Bolivia. It now has a certificate of origin, quinoa real, just like champagne comes from Champagne, France, and no one else can reproduce that. Because what happens is this adapted quinoa is adapted in lesser quality soils. It can accumulate anything that's there, including artificial fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides. The quinoa that you get internationally that's not Bolivian is not organic. Okay, only the Bolivian quinoa is certified organic. Check when you buy your packaging. At the same time, it's a smaller seed, it's lesser quality, it doesn't have all of the nutrition value, vitamins and minerals that the Bolivian quinoa has. A lot of times the Bolivian quinoa is mixed in with this lesser quality quinoa, so it looks better. But people don't understand this. There's not a lot of education, and what people are getting, the cheap quinoa, is cheap quinoa. And this really good, robust, special quinoa is being forced to being sold as cheap quinoa as well, because up until now, there's never been a market really developed that recognizes and honors the distinct difference of this amazing royal quinoa in Bolivia. So if we go back to the time of Pachacuti, Sumac Kamana, right? We have these principles of sustainability that we're working on, right? Sufficient, not efficient economy. Well, this should be good enough. You know, why do we need to be selling quinoa to the world? Let's just do local production and consumption. Less is more. Except the bottom line is the farmers cannot survive on local consumption, right? We live in a global market, a global economy, and we need those outside resources to be able to help distribute earnings to everybody. Right? So we have this idea of food sovereignty, we have this idea of well-being, and our farmers are being left out, and we have a little bit of a tension here between this idea of Sumac Kamana and being able to live well, okay? And where do we define our communities, right? Because as we're eating the food that the Bolivians toiled to produce, aren't they also part of our own community? Okay, so what happened after the boom? Real quick, we'll take a peek. Okay, so we had the certification, you know, where a lot of the lands that were processed for quinoa production were left open, and they've become a lot of windstorms have been kind of like bringing the topsoils around almost like a dust bowl, which is causing erosion. We've had communities that have been renovated, so these old adobe houses have been rebuilt with new adobe and tin roofs or with bricks. We have people buying cars, SUVs. You need SUVs to get out here, and because it's very rural and remote. So they're no longer relying on public transportation that was very sporadic. So now they have access to their own means of transportation, and there's been a lot of urban migration. So people have bought houses. Remember, they earned a tremendous amount of money during that boom, even though it was a few years. They took that money and bought houses and stores in the city so that they had alternative economies. So they're diversifying their family earnings. 20% of the cultivated area has been reduced, so they're not growing as much quinoa anymore, but they're still growing more than they have. Each year they grow a little more, but not as much as they did during the boom. And they have semi-abandoned communities now. So we have this new language called estantes. And estantes are the people that come out to these rural areas in their private SUVs from their own homes in the city for village festivals, for voting, for planting. But they don't live there anymore. So the cultural and language traditions are no longer being passed down. And we have 50% of residentes who do live there, but it's mostly the elderly. So a lot of the kids are now in the city. They're not learning the native languages in native ways. And it's kind of a punishment almost when they have to go out to the countryside to hang out with grandma in the village. They'd rather be with their video games in the city. So there's a real culture shift, and it's just been a couple of years, and it's been extreme. Okay, and then we also have 40% less llamas, which is huge because the families used to all have their own llama herds, and they can't manage them now because they're not living there. So they're paying the residentes, who are only a few people, to take care of the llama herds, and the herds have gotten less. And remember, we need that llama manure to grow quinoa. So big problem there. What does it look like? Here's Ortuyo, which is outside of Salinas, the quinoa capital of Oruro. And we see these beautiful rebuilt country homes, but it's empty. Okay, there's no one in their schools, their hospitals, it's closed down. People come here for weekends and festivals, and that's it. And here we have Quillakas, also an abandoned town. We have just llamas wandering around. Again, people haven't lived here in a long time. This shows the poverty from the Quinoa zone. Okay, so just real quick to summarize here, and then we're going to go and meet Celia, who's a quinoa farmer, and we'll have some quick questions. So we see since 2015 to 17, the value, millions of dollars of our quinoa exports. So even though the value is going down, $74 million, the quantity is going up. And that's because that price per pound of quinoa is dropping. So they're making 18% less selling their quinoa, the farmers do, and just this 2-year drop from 15 to 17, right, 2017, yet they're still producing more and more quinoa. So it's showing the hopefulness and the resilience of the indigenous people, but it's also showing the destitution and tremendous disadvantage that they're starting to face in these world markets. And here, the US is buying the majority of the Bolivian quinoa, okay? Here's France, Netherlands, Canada, Germany, and the rest of the world, okay? Just to let you guys know the supply chain, how it works real quick. If I was to buy, let's say, a pound of quinoa here in Brattleboro, it costs $7.17 a pound. That was in 2017. Okay, of that, 29 cents went to the quinoa producer, 41 cents went to the cooperative machinery, right, their processing plant that they pay for. $1.86 went to the person that then packed up that quinoa, stuck it on a ship, and sent it to the United States, and then found the company that they were going to resell that quinoa to. Okay, for example, Ancient Harvest. $2.60 comes from that company that buys that like giant container of quinoa and then repackages it into their own products, puts in their labeling, their marketing, finds supermarkets to sell it in, and then boom, ships it out wholesale to the supermarket. And then the supermarket flips it, charging an extra $1.65 to cover their cost of employees, real estate, utilities, all of that, right? So all of this together makes up that final price of $7.17 for a pound of quinoa that the farmer gets 29 cents for. And we're going to look at an alternative now that I've created where that no longer happens, because that 29 cents is not a living wage, it's not a dignified wage, but it's the only wage that they can get at the moment. Okay, I'm going to call up Celia and Kaye on the phone, and she's just going to tell us real quick how things are for her right now, because I do not like speaking for the producers themselves, because they are right here and can speak for themselves. So I'm going to call her up, and she's going to speak a little bit about her experience. She's a quinoa producer, and she's one of the leaders of the Anapki Cooperative. I'm going to translate for you as she speaks in Spanish. Hola, Celia, ¿cómo estás?
Hola, Tamara, buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes, estamos aquí aprendiendo de la cuenta de quinoa. ¿Quieres hablar un poco de tu experiencia? Yo puedo traducir.
Está bien, Tamara, puedo conversar. Pregúntame y entonces yo voy respondiendo.
Sí, después vamos a tener preguntas, pero por un momento puedes decir cómo estás ahora, qué está pasando en el campo, cómo sientas ahora con la producción, los desafíos, logros que tienen.
Ya, a ver, Tamara, están ahorita en una reunión, ¿no?
Sí.
A ver, bueno, pues en primer lugar yo quisiera saludarles a todos ustedes que están en una reunión allá en Europa, hablando desde aquí, Bolivia, ¿no?
Yeah, so she's greeting everybody in the meeting and thanking you for being here. Sigue.
Y soy socio de la Asociación Nacional de Productores de Quinoa, ANAPI, que le conocen entre nacional y internacional a ANAPI, ¿no?
Mm-hmm.
Soy socia.
Yeah, so she's a member of ANAPI. Yeah, sigue.
Bueno, pues yo tal vez quisiera comentar a los que están escuchando en Europa el caso de la producción de la quinoa aquí en Bolivia. En primero yo quisiera decir antes aquí expresado antes en 1930 quinoa bien despreciado, como nos des comida de los pájaros y la comida del indio. Y lo alimento, nutrición, ¿no? Que le despreciaban la gente. Pero hoy en día la quinoa es muy valorado porque es el mejor alimento mundialmente. Ya sabemos que los científicos, los astronautas consumen quinoa. De ese modo, nosotros en esos años nos hemos organizado como productores de quinoa, porque nos engañaban eran personas intermediarias que compraban la quinoa con un precio de menos con 40 bolivianos, ¿no? Nos organizamos recién gracias a la quinoa, porque nuestra quinoa es bueno. La quinoa de Bolivia, que es producida en las orillas de la quinoa es muy alimento. Un ejemplo en estos meses que ha pasado la pandemia COVID-19. Ahora, ¿qué es lo que ha pasado? A ver, yo hermanos de Europa, nosotros de quinoa aquí en Bolivia enfermamos COVID, estamos sanos hasta el momento. Aquí es muy bueno, es muy sustentable para la comida, ¿no? Yo sé que usted recientemente están
Ya, bueno, Celia, sabes, no tenemos la mejor conexión, pero tengo la mayoría de tu mensaje que voy a repartir. ¿Está bien? Ya.
¿Cómo?
Sí, no tenemos un buen comunicación, pero después puedo llamarte de nuevo si tenemos preguntas, pero voy a repartir lo que decía a la gente. Bueno.
Ya, sí, ahora hay señal ahora.
Hay señal ahora, pero sí, estamos con bajo tiempo, entonces voy a transducir lo que tú decías y voy a llamarte de nuevo a partir de 20 minutos, algo así, si hay otras preguntas más específicas. Bueno.
Sí, yo lo que quería decir tal vez, Tamara, consumir quinoa es lo muy importante, ¿no? Eso es como productores de quinoa, nosotros tal vez fácil no producimos, es difícil. Y a la vez en el cerro, a nosotros nos afecta la sequía, el viento, nos afecta mucho las plagas también, ¿no? Por eso nuestra quinoa nosotros producido es orgánicamente. Tamara, eso tal vez yo quisiera poner en conocimiento porque tienes muy corto el tiempo para conversar, parece, ¿no?
Sí, sí, excelente. Voy a repartir y nos hablaremos en un poco tiempo, ¿ya? Gracias.
Bueno,
ya, chao.
Ya, me vuelves nomás a llamar. Chao, chao.
Chao, chao. Okay, so basically what we heard Celia saying there was she was talking about how, since 1997, quinoa was always just looked at as food for the birds, right? And it wasn't something that was valued. And how now, they've had this opportunity to introduce quinoa as the best alimento, right? The best food for the world. And they're really taking very serious this time, for example, of the pandemico and feeling this responsibility to feed and keep healthy the world. And one of the things I'm continuing to hear farmers say again and again is in the quinoa fields, they're healthy, they're safe, everything is okay for them, they're eating their quinoa. She also remembered how quinoa used to be valued at 40 Bolivianos for a quintal, right? You'd have to sell five bags of quinoa for one bag of sugar. It was so undervalued. And how, now quinoa has so much more meaning, and we need to remember that. And she was talking about also how the scientists and the producers, are committed to having organic quinoa and making sure it's safe and healthy. And it's something that's going to be an example and to help us throughout this pandemic, right, for being safe. So she wanted to share that with you. Okay, and she'll be back afterwards when we have questions and answers. We can always call her back again. real quick. And what I'm going to do now is just take a quick pause and go to Julie and see if there's any biting questions or probing questions out there from the audience. And then we're going to jump into what my research has found in the quinoa fields.
Yeah, great. Wonderful, Tamara. Thanks. I think we're just going to field 2 questions, and I'm going to pass it to Maya so that she can do so.
Okay. This is fantastic, Tamara. I'm learning so much, and it seemed like such a little teaser the other day when I was on with you and Julie on the plastic practice call, and this is really tremendous. And Scott Cooper actually, so these 2 questions are really quite interrelated, and Scott is asking a question that I had asked you during the practice time, and I just think it's such a critically important piece of the puzzle of all of sort of colonialization and oppression. And he says, regarding imperialization and colonization, how in the world and why in the world would the Spanish ban a food?
Right, and that was just part of, you know, the culture at that time, right, with the idea of ethnocentrism, where the Spanish came with their cows and their sheep, and, you know, same thing with the English and the colonists to the United States, right? I'm reading 1493 right now. So they bring what's familiar to them, right? This is what's familiar. This is how they think things should be eaten. If you remember, during the time, there was a lot of unknowns. We didn't understand the world like we do now. The church was very involved. There was that idea of taming the savage beast. Right, so the idea that Native people were savages, that they were animals, you know, that their traditions were animalistic, that they were unintelligent. So all of that, you know, idea of not valuing Native traditions and foods goes back to that period of time and that mindset. And there was actually a very healthy and robust culture that they discovered when they went to Machu Picchu and Cusco and discovered the Andean people, and that was suppressed, right? That wasn't communicated back to Europe because Europe was suffering right at that time, and this was a very robust people, and they didn't want the European country to know that there's another way of being. So a lot of the information was not shared, and those stories, you'll see those kind of colonialism stories all around the world, you know, as people kind of want to recreate the world, you know, their experience from their perspective, which isn't really reflective of what's actually happening.
Sure. Well, and David Bray is asking if you can sort of fill in some of the gaps from colonial times to when the Royal Quinoa started to be produced again. He mentions Kevin Haley's chapter on quinoa in his 2001 book on grassroots development in Bolivia. And he says in that chapter, he talks about going back just a few decades when quinoa was forgotten and only poor people were eating it. And also in your price history, you go back to 1990, but could you talk about the period before then? When did quinoa begin to be produced again? And, you know, just sort of talk a little bit more about how it emerged from obscurity and entered the world stage.
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting story, and that's a great book. I've read it too. Basically, a lot of what we see happening came from the 1952 land reform, because up until then, there was a hacienda system in Bolivia where the Spanish owned the land, and the Bolivians were indentured servants upon that land. And even my mother-in-law grew up as an indentured servant as a child. What happened was, as indentured servants, they had to produce, you know, a certain amount of product on the padrino's land, the patron, the landowner, and then that person, the padron, would sell the product in the market. So the indigenous people weren't given access to the markets. They had their own little local markets that they could sell at, and they used something called aini, which is barter, because they didn't have access to a lot of cash. That's why Celia talks about the value of sugar compared to quinoa by bags of quinoa. Because even now in the countryside, there's still a lot of barter, and people measure things by how many bags of what can buy what instead of money. And so in that time of land reform, the land was redistributed back to the rural people. And over time, there'd been more and more legal rights given to the rural people. And well, this is 2009 with the Evo presidency, they actually gave women lands rights too, and inheritance rights, which was significant. But before that, there was a neoliberal kind of resurgence in Bolivia back in the 70s and the 80s. Jeffrey Sachs, if anyone knows that name, went in and did a shock economics, program in Bolivia and tried to kind of get this backward socialist state into the modern times by having the government privatize everything, break down the worker unions, and just kind of, turbocharge the economy. Put the country into hyperinflation, caused a complete government collapse. He since has softened his approach towards economics because he did this in Poland also, and it was a disaster. But anyway, so from all of that, though, came development money, right? From the privatization came the development money, because the idea is that you're selling all this stuff and we're going to go help you. So USAID actually did a lot, so did the European Union, in helping to create new economies for the Bolivian people. And one of the areas that they were working in was the quinoa. So there was this idea of popular participation, which was going on in the 90s by the time I got there. And that was kind of trying to set up some kind of more rural democracy representation that inadvertently led to Evo Morales becoming president, which was not the intent of that kind of program. But it was, all of those different types of development models coming in and helping to pull people out of poverty, right? That was kind of some of the development language at the time, and create new markets for these forgotten products. And that's sort of the background of where quinoa was starting to get developed. And it was a very slow process, but yeah.
Do you want to take one more quick question about the actual growing of the quinoa?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Dan and Gail MacArthur, your neighbors on Ames Hill, would like to know, they say that the growing of quinoa looks so lush compared to the background. It does grow on the edges of the salt flats, and they're asking if it is ever irrigated or how it gets water.
Yeah, not really, because the problem with irrigation is if you continue to irrigate an area, it's going to start getting built up of salts. Also, it'll start getting overproduced, right? Because then you're always irrigating the same area over and over, and it's very expensive and difficult to do irrigation. So there were a couple of fair trade funded projects that kind of did that, but it wasn't working well. And basically it's just, pray to the gods. That's why they do prayers to the gods when they plant the quinoa, when they harvest the quinoa, because really they're reliant on the natural environment for the water that's needed for the plants. And there's key times in the quinoa production, especially in the spring, and they'll use bioindicators. They'll look at the frost on the ground, where birds build their nests, how many eggs are in the nest, what does the sky look like in the nighttime, how hazy are the stars, and all those indicators are what they use to be able to predict and know when to plant, when to harvest, what that harvest might be. But it's hard. With climate change now, it's really, really hard. But no, they don't do, irrigation really isn't a good solution for them.
Okay, thank you for that. Do you want to move on to the next part of your presentation?
Yeah, I'll move on. I'm looking at our time, and I want to definitely give people a chance to participate more. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of flip through a little bit quickly some of the research I did and what I found out, because that's important.
Yes.
But I'm also mindful that I want to give folks a little more time to ask questions as well. Good?
Great, thank you.
All right, so here we go. So the survey, so one of the things that I did as a Fulbright scholar, right, I was doing research. So, and I've since published this in lots of different places. But one of the things that I did was a survey tool, right? And I used a tool that was developed by a United Nations development program group based out of Australia, where I'm a member. It's called Circles of Sustainability. And it's basically a survey asking people, what do you think? Right? What do you think your economic well-being is? What do you think your market access is? And people answer on a scale of 1 to 5. We actually did the same study in Putney, and it's on my books to do that in in Brattleboro too, as soon as we get through this pandemic and my students can get out there again. But anyway, so this study is a place-based study, and what it does is it creates a way to imagine and measure sustainability based on people's own perception of their own well-being, instead of traditional economic indicators of how much money do you make, how long do you live, what's your education level, right? So you can use that in addition to those traditional economic measurements. But here what we're looking at is people's own experience. And the way the study works is it measures people on 4 areas: economics, ecology, culture, and politics. This is our results in Bolivia. And the results are tabulated out on a circle, where as you get closer out, it's more robust, closer to that number 5, it becomes green. And as you come in, remember it's a scale of 1 to 5, as you come into the center, it becomes yellow, then orange, then red. If you get to like a number 1, you think things are really bad. So I did 392 surveys throughout the entire rural quinoa zone. And the way I had them done was I had high school students, high school seniors would go and do the surveys amongst their family members and community. So that way I had people from the community surveying people from the community, so there was more trust and understanding in the process, and we got more accurate results. And what we found was super interesting, because in other places, you know, where they've done this survey, even in Putney, in South Africa, in Porto Alegre, in Brazil, all over the world, it's usually varied. But here, Bolivia, we have a very cohesive culture, and everyone's pretty much feeling all right with everything, even though they've had the quinoa boom, even though, you know, they've had a lot of hardships. And here we see that resurgence of indigenous identity. So the culture is just so robust, which is something you really don't see anywhere else in the world on these circle studies. But in Bolivia, the people were feeling super, super proud of their culture and dress and traditions. They were bothered by climate change. They were bothered by the political situation, where they felt like, even though Evo did wonderful things for them, they were feeling like there was less and less room for new ideas to come forward. And also we saw there was a little bit of preoccupation, a little worry about that economic drop in the quinoa prices. The other thing that I did was, besides just a survey, which kind of puts words in people's mouths, I wanted to just hear the words from the people's mouths. So I used another research method called the talking stick, which comes from the Native Americans here in the United States. And as a way they would do council, right, where everyone sits around and passes a stick and speaks their mind while everyone listens. And we talked about, what does sustainability mean to you? Because my big question was, as the quinoa was failing, and there were other options for people to leave the countryside and just do something else, they insisted on staying. And why, right? What was that idea of perseverance, right, and resilience? I wanted to understand that better. So what does sustainability mean to you? What are the disadvantages? What are the challenges? What are the benefits? And so I had over 9 workshops with more than 100 participants, a lot of people speaking in their native languages. I had translators. And what I found was some changes over time. Okay, so here we found more and more. And what I did was I took the research and I took the responses and just quantified like the themes that people talked about and how often they came up. Right, so these weren't themes I created. These were themes that they brought up themselves. So climate was continuing to be problematic, as we would have huge dust storms coming in and just covering up the quinoa plants and really causing problems, and just the irregularities we have with climate change in general. Gender is evening out. In the past, there's this thing called Chachawadami, where men and women work together equally, but the women also were taking care of the kids and the household, so it wasn't so equal, and that's been getting addressed more. Quinoa, they found, was super important. When they made all this money and were able to buy fancy city food, all of the quinoa growers were happy to buy flour and processed rice and noodles and all these like city foods, and they found that their children's nutrition got worse. And when quinoa became so inexpensive, so cheap, they started eating it again and saw that their children were able to pay better attention in school, were more calm, were more focused. And that's because quinoa has a low glycemic index and a high protein. So it actually was benefiting the children to eat quinoa in the morning and not their processed cereals. Land was becoming less problematic as they were getting more used to being more careful in how they were managing their land. The herds, again, those llama herds are starting to become really problematic. There's no llama abono, manure, which is a super important part of the cycle of the quinoa and also of the heritage and culture of the people in that area. The quinoa, the llama, and the person, the 3 of them together are the core of what lives in that region. And then economy, ironically, you know, after they got over the fact that everything is collapsing, people kind of settled down and they took this 500-year view, which is kind of indicative of indigenous thinking, where they said, well, our ancestors survived worse, we can deal with this. And I thought that was really interesting, again, showing that indigenous resilience in times of extreme change. What I'm going to do now is go and look at, so back to that original question, what's the future of these producers? And what I found was then once my research ended, right, in 2018, I could do stuff. So up until then, I've been kind of educating the Bolivians a little bit on markets and differentiation and competition and what could happen. And what I did was I brought this back to the classroom. And what my students did was they created a Kickstarter and they created a company called The Perfect Seed. And this is a cooperative. It's a mutually beneficial enterprise registered here in the state of Vermont. We have a board of directors equally made up of Bolivian producers and USA people. And what we're doing now is celebrating the hand-grown Royal Quinoa varieties that no one never knew about. Even the agronomists that were in the countryside from USAID for 20 years developing quinoa didn't realize that these varieties had distinct culinary purposes, right? They just thought of them as like, you know, agricultural differences. But me being a woman and hanging out with the women in their kitchens, because that was my way of doing research, I saw that, wait a second, they didn't just cook with white quinoa. They cooked with white Toledo quinoa, or white Pendela quinoa, or white Quispina quinoa. And all of these varieties had distinct recipes associated with them. And when I worked with women from Aymara's descent, from Quechua descent, from Oruro, from Potosí, they all had the same recipes, the same uses. And nobody knew about this, not even the Bolivians in the city. I was like, what? Here's our market, okay? Because also these quinoa varieties can't be grown outside of Bolivia because they're specifically adapted for the Bolivia climate. And they have higher nutrition and protein and amino acids and everything else than any other quinoa out there. So here I saw a tremendous opportunity, okay? And what I did was I worked with the Bolivian farmers because I had a fair trade company where we told our knitters what to do. And instead I wanted Perfect Seed to be different where we're working together. And that's why Celia's here, because she's one of the producers. We work together. I don't talk about the Bolivian quinoa producers without them being here and having known what I'm saying. I went over this presentation with at least 6 different Bolivian quinoa producers before you guys ever saw this. So anyway, what we have going on here is, this is 2017, prices haven't changed much. Conventional cheapo quinoa from Peru, $1,900 a ton. Fair trade organic, $2,600 a ton. Okay, regular old organic, $23.5. You can't even get any fair trade quinoa anymore because no one wants to buy it. Okay, you don't even see it in the stores. What we're proposing is $3,454 a ton because that is a dignified wage. And I learned that by talking to hundreds of quinoa producers all throughout Bolivia for 3 years. So how in the world can you sustain a business where the price of quinoa is 45% higher than the market price? And what's interesting too, because some people say, well, those farmers are just greedy. But actually they're not, because this price that they're setting is not the price of the boom. Okay, it's what they were earning in 2015, right? A little less than what they earned in 2015. It's not a ridiculous price, but it's a price that's going to give them a dignified living. And if we look here, this is real quick. This is just Bolivia data. I'm showing the lower class, middle class, and upper class. And what's the average monthly earnings for a Bolivian family in Bolivia, which is the gray, and in the Altiplano, the highlands where the quinoa growers are. So we see that the difference between the blue and the gray from poor, medium, rich is significant, right? The people in the highlands are always earning less. And here in our quinoa story, even the people making the fair trade price are still not earning anywhere near what the average Bolivian earns, the median income. But by getting that dignified wage, they earn more. And by earning more, what happens is they can live like we do here in Vermont. They can have a house that has electricity and water and electric and hot shower. They can have a computer and education and Wi-Fi. They can have a bicycle and a car and be able to have a dignified living that isn't very different from people living in downtown Brattleboro. And that's what they don't have right now. So that's what we're fighting for, a dignified wage so people in the countryside can live just like people in the city without having to leave the countryside, okay? And we're able to preserve that rural way of being. So looking at what's the future of our producers, so what we have here is this idea of our we now have a website, perfectseed.com. We have our quinoa for sale. We've made amazing recipes that my husband, Jesse Lepkoff, created. He's a chef. And we've created recipes that respect the varieties and the specific characteristics. Like creamy caspina is sushi quinoa, and it's amazing. It sticks together all by itself. And I've even made pancakes from it. It's amazing. So with Sumac Kamana, we're looking at how can we support this, right-sized production, right-priced production, something that's going to enable the Bolivians to have a dignified way of living. That quinoa that's hand-grown and slow-farmed and valued for that. We don't have high yields. We don't have 2 harvests a year. We have heirloom varieties. They're carefully produced with love. They're blessed, they're organic, and they're part of this cultural story. We have direct sale. So by paying the Bolivians so much more, we want to pay them 51 cents a pound. It's 30% increase from today's prices. By giving them that little teeny tiny few pennies more a pound, it doesn't cost that much more to us because we're knocking out the middleman. We're doing direct sales. We're working with Organist, highest quality blessed quinoa. We have this denomination of origin, which was just passed last month. Okay, so we're working with Quinoa Real. Right now in Vermont, you can buy this quinoa. Riverbend Farm Market is selling Perfect Seed Royal Quinoa in all these different varieties. So is Lawrence's Smoke Shop in Towson and Wilmington. You can buy stuff online, and I'm expanding that. Right now, I only have 2 varieties online. And you can call me. I'm working with Ian Diamondstone. He's doing our wholesale. But you could call me on WhatsApp if you're international. I know I have some international friends here. Hi, guys. And you can also just email me. Okay. And Landmark College did a Kickstarter. Okay. They raised $5,798 in sales on Kickstarter. And some of those sales were from you guys in our local town of Brattleboro in Vermont. So thank you so much for supporting us on that. Okay, so I just want to do a big shout out. Thank you to all of the dozens of people who have been out there, the quinoa communities, all of the different organizations that just worked with me for all these years and were so patient in getting me to understand what's going on out there. And I'm just going to open this up now for questions. So we have about 20 minutes left, so let's hear what's going on.
Thank you so much, Tamara. This was such a wonderful presentation and such a wonderful insight into the worldview of people in Bolivia. So while we're waiting for a few questions to come in, I'm going to take the liberty as the moderator to ask the first question. And actually I have 2 questions. One is very short, I think. You use the words when you're talking about the producers and people in the United States as USA people. And you didn't use the word Americans when you were talking about people in the United States. I wonder if you can speak more about why you used those words as USA people and what that might mean to Bolivians.
Right, that's a really important question because we are all Americans, as Bolivians like to point out, whether we're Central America, South America, North America, we are all Americans together. Okay, so to create that distinction of what part of America I'm talking about, I usually say USA people. I could say North Americans, but then that also kind of brings in Canada, and I'm not talking about Canada. So that's why I make that distinction.
Yeah, great. I just love that. I love that you did that. So this model of quinoa that you're talking about, and also this model of sumac kamana and the way that people think about kind of having enough. And this idea of kind of, really focusing on their environment and being connected and having ceremony that's attached to that. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about how those practices might have been upheld through this whole economic boom and then downturn, because when you did your research, you found that there was this strength in sustaining the cultural identity, which I found to be really fascinating, because there's a lot of research that shows that when people experience, what might be called the good life of getting access to money and buying things and moving to cities and having video games, that the cultural identity then gets lost or forgotten, whereas it doesn't seem to be what you found when you were there. So can you speak a little bit more about why you think that's the case and what might have allowed that sustaining of that cultural identity?
Yeah, so what we found very, very quickly was a complete loss of language, which is really interesting because it was just so fast and so complete. Because what happens is when you're in the countryside, people speak the native language. And by the children, this is like, a 5-6 year period of time, sort of more or less, since the family started getting money and getting houses in the cities, right? And not being in the countryside all the time. So in the cities, people speak Spanish, and in the schools, they're taught in Spanish. And even though Quechua or Aymara might be a home language, children understand it, but they don't speak it to each other. And then what happens is their children don't learn the language. So that's how languages die out pretty rapidly. And the quinoa producers are already seeing their children refusing to speak their native languages. So that's one of the places where culture is being lost. Even now, as people are challenged with climate conditions, and they're using the old bioindicators, they're lamenting the fact that we don't have our elders with us anymore. Our elders knew how to do this. They knew how to deal with climate change, and they're not here, and we don't know what to do. And we wish we had listened to them more while we still could have. And what's happening now is more of our elders are being left in the countryside and nobody's with them. So that happenstance, right? Because you don't just go to the countryside and say, elder, teach me something, right? What happens is one day you're walking and something happens and the elder tells the story, right? And if you're not here with them that day when something happened to hear that story, then that story will never be heard. So that's what's starting to happen, is that lack of continuity, that lack of just always being there, is where the culture is getting lost, because it's not just going in to dance in the plaza in a costume once a year.
Right.
That's not the culture. It's more that every day that's being lost and not being valued, right? The children roll their eyes when they have to go out to the countryside to visit grandma, on the quinoa farm. It's not so fun. And, and that's something that people are recognizing, that's giving them heartache, right? They feel sad about that.
Right. Yeah, I have a follow-up question about that, but I'm going to go to some of the questions that are coming in from the audience members. The first that I want to respond to is from Paul Love, and it's a question about the cooperative, and are there plans to have the products come to the co-op in Brattleboro?
Yeah, so we're working on that little by little, right? Everything takes time, and there's definitely a method of how products are purchased in different places, and there's different supply chains, right? And there's different incentives. When I first started this project, that was my target audience, was the USA United Cooperative Association, right, of grocery stores in the United States. And I went to their meeting. I said, I got this product. We're a cooperative. Let's go. Boom. And they said, actually, we're really sorry things have changed. I was like, what? They said, well, United Foods, which is also a cooperative, was bought by Amazon. I was like, yeah. And they said, well, so is Whole Foods. I'm like, okay. They said, well, that's our number one market. So United Foods was selling to Whole Foods. I'm sorry, United Foods I don't think was bought by Amazon. Whole Foods was bought by Amazon, and Whole Foods was United Foods' number one client. And Amazon dictated what they were buying and what they weren't buying from United Foods. And United Foods had to adjust their supply chain or else be knocked out of the market. So that put a lot of pressure on them. And then also the way United Foods works with the cooperative is by scale. So the more products I buy from United Foods, the more discounts I get as a cooperative. And cooperatives hold their earnings to such a tight margin, right? All in the entire grocery store industry, it's very different. I worked in fashion. We have big margins, but in the grocery store industry, you have very tight margins. And that little 1 or 2% bonus that you get in reduction from cost from buying a lot of product from United Foods inhibits inhibits small cooperatives from buying from other sources. So that was a problem. And I was really surprised. The National Cooperative Association of Grocery Stores said, it's very difficult for us to not buy outside of our current supply chain because of those restrictions. So so I was like, okay, great. So now we're working with small gourmet markets instead as being our target retail. And that's working very well, actually.
Nice, fantastic, good. So this question actually came up before. I know the information might be available on your website as well, but can you talk a little bit about the nutritional difference between Quinoa Royal and the other types you find in the supermarket? And And then also, can you speak a little bit about how you tell the difference between those? And this is a combination of questions, but that last, the former question was from Angela and Richard Nicoletti.
Yeah, sure. And I actually have some of the questions up here, but it's hard for me to look at them. But I'm sure people can see the questions too, so maybe I shouldn't put them up because that might be distracting. But anyway, what the difference is, it's really hard to tell because every quinoa is different and every harvest is different. And I haven't done an analysis of looking at the quinoas in the supermarket, for example, and seeing how are they defining their protein content. I know from the quinoas that we're working with, and from the agronomists and the analysis that they've done in the fields, that we have incredibly high levels of omega-3s, of magnesium. I was actually just writing a paper, a pitch. I'm doing a pitch competition actually for us as a cooperative, and I had that exact data. But what we're looking at, I think it was like 68%. I'm going to pull it up so I have the exact numbers for you guys. But yeah, but what we have is higher amounts of, here we go. Here's our application. You see my rough draft. Let's see. Dun, 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 dun. Here it is. Okay, so we're looking at, boom. Okay, so we have a minimum of 6 grams of complete complex proteins. And that's significant because quinoa is the only plant, one of the only plant-based plants that has a complete protein, like all of the kinds of proteins that you would find in a meat source. What we found also is, especially in times of COVID, people don't want to be eating meat anymore. They feel like it's unsafe. Sometimes it's even hard to find because of the disruptions in the production chain. It also has 4 grams of omega-3 fatty acids. So compare this to the boxes of quinoa you have at home that might not be perfect seed, and then you'll know the difference. We also have a lot of antioxidants and essential minerals. We have magnesium is 68% of the daily amount of magnesium. And the National Institute of Health said magnesium helps to calm the nerves and soothe the body. And that's what people in Bolivia are saying too, that they feel calm in this pandemic. They feel strong, they feel supported. It has 39% phosphorus, which is really important for bone growth and blood. Calcium 13% and iron 12%, which is huge. So having this, and actually the people in the countryside also eat llama meat, and there was a scientific study done saying that llamas have some kind of property in them that fights COVID for real. That was a scientific thing. But anyway, so these are the percentages. This is the analysis that I have of our quinoa. And I would just say, you know, go check your quinoa, see if it has the same stuff. It should probably have less.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Another question from Nellie Sargassian. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. She's asking, in which ways have the Bolivian quinoa growers with whom you've been working in the cooperative benefited from their collaboration with you? And as a follow-up, kind of in what ways, what are the ways in which you're making your relationships with them sustainable in the long term?
Yeah, so that's one of the big things. In fact, I was just talking with Celia today. So I have Celia's quinoa as my quinoa negra that we're selling. And we also have other quinoa from other cooperatives. And what I tell the Bolivians is this is a program that's developed with them, right? So we're very transparent in everything we do. And for example, right now I'm kind of focused on the USA market, but we're a little teeny tiny company, right? And we're here in Brattleboro, and we're sort of in like, you know, the Northeast, but there's a whole world out there, you know, and I tell the farmers, I'm like, take this information, you know, use this information to go and sell it to Europe, you know, use this information to sell to Australia and Southeast Asia and China, you know, value what you're doing. And Celia was really excited because just last month, they finally got the certificate of origin for Royal Quinoa that they've been fighting for years to get. And now they have it. Of course, enforcing it's another thing, but this is another tool that they have, right? I'm teaching them, how do you market yourselves, right? How do you, because they don't know, right? They eat this stuff all the time themselves, but to translate their ways to modern language is really difficult, because it's like if I'm trying to sell my quinoa to someone that lives on the moon, I don't know how they live. I don't know what they want. I don't know anything about them, right? I know how I do it, but I don't know how they do it, right? It's like trying to sell someone maple syrup. So yeah, so I work as the interpreter, but it's very transparent. And that's how people are able to benefit, because we've had these presentations where we've gone up to government ministries and said, hey, look, we need some help here. You know, we need you to get back behind this quinoa, this Royal Quinoa thing. We need you to be setting up buying offices like Peru did in the United States. We need you to be bringing in development programs and helping to protect these markets, and not just saying, oh, go do it yourself with the Pachamama. You know, we need some intervention. So having this kind of hard data showing that people are not doing as well as you think they are was really important, because the government even was thinking the quinoa people were being greedy and that they had so much money, and they didn't realize how much the downside of the market was really affecting these people. So, you know, in those ways, being speaking in English and sharing this information to more people who would have not known about this, right, is ways that we're able to kind of collaboratively share, you know, bring more awareness, educate. That's the biggest challenge right now, is just educating people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And we're doing it together, right? We're educating together.
Well, Bob Tortolani has a question that is also related to just food and harvest and educating. So he's wondering if there's any recipes that you use that include maple syrup with quinoa. And is there a kind of a warm cereal recipe that you could recommend? I know you mentioned before that children, you know, eating it before school definitely helps them with their schoolwork. Yeah.
Oh my God, we love it. Well, Julie, you and I had like the delicious pisancayas now.
I know, those were so great.
When we were witches on the West River.
Yes.
But yeah, so there's all kinds of really delicious things you can make with quinoa. Me and Jesse have been playing around with it. I have all the indigenous recipes. They don't have maple syrup, but I've brought them maple syrup from Vermont and they love it. I have to explain it's chancaca del árbol, which means like sugarcane from the tree. That's how I have to explain maple syrup to the Bolivians. But they all have Robb Family Farm maple syrup down in Bolivia, and they love it. You know, quinoa is so versatile. There's so much that you can do with it. I would say like one of the really cool things that we have is the quinoa negra. What we've been doing is marketing to foodies, and like everyone's home now with the pandemic, bored to death. So like we've been giving people lots of fun things to do, like take your quinoa and hand grind it with a hand grinder. You know, just something to do, you know, grind it with a stone. And you can put it in your coffee grinder. It's not as good though. But you can grind like the black quinoa. You can toast it and grind it and just like sprinkle it in a smoothie and put some maple syrup in it with a little bit of kale, maybe some soy milk, a banana. And that's like such a great way to put in nutrition. You can take the pisancaya, which is really fun. That's like, Celia had it, like she was on the phone teaching me how to cook it when I was here in the US and she was in the countryside. I kept sending her pictures. She's like, that's not right. And I finally got it right. But you can, you know, toast the pisancaya and it pops. It's like popcorn. You can, you know, sprinkle that on top of your yogurt and then put a little bit, you know, just plain yogurt and then put a little maple syrup on that. Or you can just cook down, you know, quinoa can be sweet or savory. And you can take like a pandela, the rice quinoa. It cooks in such a great creamy rice style quinoa. It's just delicious. And you can have that with like salt and pepper and a little bit of, you know, plant-based butter. Or you can do it like a porridge and just put a little bit of, you know, a little maple syrup and cinnamon and a little plant-based butter. And it's delicious. It's like, you know, it's a little breakfast starter. Right. So there's a lot of really creative things that we can be doing with maple syrup and quinoa. They pair so well together.
And are some of these recipes available on your website?
Some of them are. A lot of them are on our Kickstarter. I also, some of it's on our social media, our Facebook. I think we have, what do we have? Twitter.
Great.
My students worked on this in the spring as part of their global marketing class. So nothing's been updated since the Kickstarter in June, but there's stuff out there. And if you email me, I could probably send you some more stuff. And when you buy the quinoa, it comes with a recipe card and all kinds of ways of how to produce it and cook it.
Fantastic. That's great. So there's a few shout outs. One is from Tamara. And she says, hi, Tamara, this is Tamara, your Jamaican cousin. Just wanted to say hello and let you know this was a very informative presentation.
Yeah, hi, Tamara. I want to do my next Fulbright in Jamaica.
And there's another question from Jonathan L. Well. What percentage of quinoa produced in Bolivia stays in Bolivia? And
yeah, that's really cool. And there was that like fake news story, right, years ago about how if you eat quinoa, the Bolivians are starving. And that was such an awful story. It was done by a BBC reporter that was in Bolivia reporting on something else. and just happened to be in a grocery store, and someone's like, oh, this quinoa is so expensive, I can hardly afford to eat it. And he's like, oh, and I started asking other people in the grocery store and came up with this, you know, little side story about quinoa is so expensive, people in Bolivia can't eat it. And it went viral. And it was really poorly researched. You know, most people in Bolivia don't shop at a grocery store. Only the very rich can afford a grocery store. They mostly shop in markets. And there's always quinoa in the markets. And there's always quinoa in the popular restaurants. And there's always quinoa in everyone's homes. You know, on the average, Bolivians eat quinoa about once a week. With the quinoa boom, they started eating quinoa 3 times a week because it was so popular and modern and fancy now to be eating quinoa. And it was getting more expensive, but it wasn't, you know, pricing out of people's ability to purchase it. It was just becoming sort of equal with a box of noodles, right? Before it used to be really cheap, now it's just regular priced. And a lot of quinoa is also just grown and consumed by the people themselves or traded. So there's actually been an increase in consumption of quinoa in Bolivia. The government also put together a lot of programs. They have quinoa milk, which I'd love to bring to the United States. So they do quinoa milk to the school kids. They have quinoa cookies and breakfasts and soups, and there's all kinds of packaged foods now. We're starting to see that all over the United States also. So the percentage of quinoa that stays in Bolivia, I'm not really sure. All I know is that the numbers of consumption continue to go up. I would guess maybe 20% of the quinoa stays in Bolivia. Sometimes it's hard to measure because some of the quinoa just stays in the household and is consumed. So it's hard to really count that because it hasn't really been sold. And when things are sold in Chayapata or in the informal markets, there's no measurement of that. So it's a good question.
Yeah.
You know, but I would say maybe like 20 or 40% at the most. I think a lot of it is an export product at this point, but there's plenty of quinoa in Bolivia.
Okay. And just related to that, Jonathan also asks, do you have insight into how quinoa or the quinoa market is perceived more broadly in Bolivia outside of the communities that grow and process it? I think you've answered this slightly, but I don't know if you want to expand a little bit more just about perceptions.
Yeah, there's a big, oh my gosh, Novo Andino trending all over the place. So there's this big resurrection of like Andean food and fancy Andean chefs and Novo Andino cuisine, especially in Peru, which is kind of like a cousin to Bolivia. And, you know, quinoa is trending, like the 5-star restaurants in Bolivia, the tourist restaurants, the big fancy hotels, they all have quinoa dishes. You know, and all the chefs are going back to the roots of their grandmothers, to their grandmother's kitchen to find these ancient recipes and bring them to these fancy restaurants. So it's all over the place, you know, and it's even amongst the foodies, you know, you find any kind of ethnic food is really coming back. And we've had so much fun doing like quinoa sushi, quinoa curry, tabbouleh quinoa, like quinoa pairs with, you know, cuisines all around the world. You know, it's really a fun thing to work with. And people in Bolivia are having a lot of fun with it too. And it's one of the things when I was there last, we were talking about, let's have a cook-off, you know, all the top chefs in Bolivia, we're gonna have a cook-off with your best quinoa dish. So yeah, people in Bolivia are very proud of their quinoa, even the people that don't particularly like the indigenous government.
Mm-hmm. And I want to just bring in another kind of conversation and question, because there's two things that I see as kind of dichotomous, like one in relation to the indigenous worldview, and then the other in relation to kind of the growth of quinoa and how that might impact that, like their environmental ethic and the way that they're protecting their environment. Of course, like the ideal would be that like the local consumption creates more sustainability environmentally, but because it's such a fragile system with the soil needing to rest, you know, how are they ensuring that that process will be possible and also continuing to produce more quinoa for an export market?
Yeah, so that goes back to those to the sumak kamana, right? Ways of being. Let me just get out of this. Okay, if we go back to here, so basically what we're looking at is, you know, how can you keep that balance, right? So the idea is that by having the quinoa right priced, right, having it be where I don't have to rip up all of my lands and never let anything go fallow just so I can break even and survive for my family, right? is what we need to be able to look at. So that's where that dignified price enables me. So the dignified price also matches a dignified production. Okay, and I didn't say that in what I was talking about. So during the quinoa boom, they work with hectareas, right, which is about 3.5 acres. So and people have plenty of land out there. Okay, so that's something that's nice. And there's laws that protect land transference. Like you can't buy quinoa land. Okay, it's not for sale. Nobody can buy it. I can't even sell it to another Bolivian because it can only be inherited through family. Okay, those are laws that protect the indigenous land rights. But at the same time, people have plenty of land, but you can wreck it, right? And what they found was during the quinoa boom, people were planting about 30 to 40 hectareas, and that's where it became unsustainable. So most families had some families had even like 60 hectareas, but it's comfortable to plant like 18 hectareas. Okay, and if you're able to make that 800 bees por quintal, which is their unit of measurement, then you're able to live off of having 12 to 18 hectareas of quinoa planted. So you're not killing yourself, just harvesting nonstop, planting nonstop, just like, you know, tremendous cost of labor and huge amounts of risk if you're over planting your land and you can't manage it. And that also brings back the balance where there's space for the llamas again. Okay, so by having the production down to 10 to 18 max, like 16 hectareas per family, and having them being able to earn that 800 bees por quintal, lets them also harvest the quinoa in a mindful way, that they have better yields, there's more protection, there's more individual attention to the seeds, and things are produced in more like a loving, balanced way instead of a, you know, kill and get everything out of the earth and let's do the most we can, you know, like a very mechanical way. All right, and that's the difference. And I saw there was a question that had come up. People were asking, what's the ceremony? And the way the ceremony works is the communication is to the ancestors and to the gods, and it's through fire. So they'll make a burnt offering, usually families, they'll burn symbolic, they're called tables, mesas, that are made of like different herbs that are symbolic of, you know, different ideas of gratitude. And you basically are asking your ancestors to not forget you, to look over to you, to care for you, to protect you. You name the ancestors, you name the mountains and the rivers and the earth mother, and you ask them to always be there at your side, looking out for you, taking care of you, and you invite them also to be a part of this, and you feed them with alcohol, with the smoke that you're communicating through, and sometimes they'll sacrifice a live llama, and that beating heart is also part of that, you know, giving back the blood that you birthed us from. You know, that idea of reciprocity is super important. And when I interviewed people, over 78% of the people said, yes, we still bless our quinoa because, oh my God, what if we didn't and something bad happened, right? So the quinoa is usually blessed at planting, at harvest, at carnival, and it's really considered a member of the family. It's something that's very precious. It's not just a plant, right? Instead, it's considered a child. It has a very cultural significance to it.
Great. I'm so happy to end this discussion today on this concept of sumac kamana and blessing the quinoa. And I'll just also state, Tamara, another comment from Scott Cooper that he says, you know, why don't you have this a full-time position as an advocate, seller, and advertiser for this product internationally on behalf of the Bolivian government? So I think that we all agree that your expertise has been very, very beneficial to us today to understand more about this wonderful product. And
Right.
I'll pass it over to Maya if she has any final remarks. And
I just want to respond to that one remark, you know, because that is a common, you know, thing that sometimes we think of, well, why don't you do this, right? But the quinoa, it's the Bolivians' quinoa, right? And the Bolivians need to, you know, they can speak for the quinoa themselves. You know, they grow this quinoa, it's their product, their heritage. You know, that's not something I want to take away from them. Okay, so I think it's really important that they're able to lead and speak for themselves and discover and develop their own product themselves. It might not be the way that we would think of it, you know, where we're like, let's go market it, blah, you know, raw, big market opportunity of charge, right? They do it differently, you know, and I think being able to respect that is really important. And, you know, that goes back to the idea of slow development,
Mhm.
You know, but there's a dynamic, right? Because we're in such a fast-paced world. But what if we all slowed down and listened to each other a little and gave each other time to speak about things in our own ways?
Well, thank you so much, Tamara. This was just, I think, what we all needed right now, sort of that message of abundance and resilience and hope and the long view. I think those are themes that are so valuable right now in our culture in general and in this exact moment with the pandemic and the election. And then also just since it's harvest season right now, really wonderful messages to continue to take to heart. So thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciated all of this. I've just learned so much through all this process.
Yeah, thanks guys.
Thank
And hey, we
you.
got 2 seats open on our board. So if anyone's interested, we're looking for more board members. Si hablan español mejor, but you don't have to. We're a bilingual board. And this is a picture of Tanupa, which is the magical mountain. Her child was the one that brought the quinoa to these lands. And it does look like something otherworldly because it is very green and robust in a land that's very dry. So thanks everybody for participating. You know, keep in touch. And yeah, it's a pleasure. And thank you, Wyndham World Affairs. You guys are amazing.
Oh, thank you much for being here today. And the recording will be available probably in the next day or so.
All right. And thank you.
Thanks,
You did a great
everyone.
job, Julia. And
Thank
yeah,
you.
Maya. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome.
All right. Bye,
All right.
everyone.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
guys.